Well, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to um, do another video continuing with the Genesis theme and looking at the question of were Adam and Eve the first two people according to the Bible that were created on the earth? I, for one, happen to think so. I know that some people completely dismiss the book of Genesis, as myth. I know that some people will consider certain parts of the book of Genesis as somewhat factual, and then mix it with other um, perspectives. And so it holds only partial truth. It doesn't hold a complete truth. I, on the other hand, believe that, or hold to the position um, that the Genesis account is an actual, literal, historical um, document, and that it holds the complete truth, the origin, the true origin of man's history, the true origins of humankind. And so that's why I think that when we consider the book of Genesis, we're actually dealing with space-time history. Now, when you look throughout the whole of Scripture at the mentioning of Adam and Eve, um, that's the whole Bible, if you consider it. The Bible considers Adam and Eve as historical people. They are talked about in terms of they're in the lineages of certain people, including the lineage of Jesus. They are referred to as people who existed in a geographical place. For instance, the Garden of Eden is actually presented as an actual place with geographical markers. So we read in the book of Genesis of the garden being in the east and having four rivers extending from it. So this would give an indication of it being an actual literal place. Now, some scholars, or critics, I should say, object to Genesis as a historical document and present it more as symbolic. And one of the things that they appeal to is, or present, is that Satan was a talking animal in the Garden of Eden. And this, they say, is symbolic. It's kind of a myth. It's not really representative of what actually took place. Well, I don't think so, and the reason why I don't think so is because there was actual dialogue between Eve and the serpent. The question is why would the author of this section of Genesis, which would be presumably Adam, pen a conversation to display symbolism? I don't think that anybody would really. You could, well, certainly it could, but I don't think that you would. Um, so it's more likely that the dialogue itself, the conversation that took place between Eve and the serpent, would have been one where it shows that it actually occurred. Moreover, we see that there are talking animals, and there are animals that are possessed by demons. And this is not foreign to the Bible. For instance, we see in the book of Numbers, Balaam had a conversation with his donkey. And we also see in the book of in the book of Matthew, that the demons begged Jesus to cast them into the swine or the pigs. So we see that there are talking animals and there are animals that are possessed by demons. So that in and of itself it's not foreign to the Bible, because again, we're existing in a supernatural universe, and therefore demons can possess animals and even talk through them. So this would have been very likely that Satan would have possessed one of the serpents that God had created, and came and talked to Eve in the garden, had a conversation with her. Um, so another thing um, that gives credence to Eve being a literal person and Adam being a literal person, is that God takes Eve out of Adam's side. And some people would say this is symbolic, but I would say this is literal. This actually took place. And if it was indeed symbolic, then it would make the statement, "This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh," unsuitable altogether in the account that we see in Genesis. Um, so the formation of Adam from the dust and Eve from Adam's side should not deter us from basic reading, or deter us from a reading, from a basic sense of what it actually says. We read in Genesis, we read of the verb yatsar in Genesis 2:7, which means to form and fashion. And so it indicates that God actually did something active. He was being active in the process of creating Adam and in the process of creating Eve from Adam. We see that the human body contains nitrogen, oxygen, calcium, and other small particles, and this is actually compatible with what we see in the earth, what the earth is composed of. Furthermore, when the body, when people die, it decomposes and becomes like the dust of the earth. It turns back into dust. So we can see this being an actual literal account. Even further beyond that, we see in Genesis 3 that Adam names his wife Eve, which means the mother of all the living, after God presents labor pains during childbirth for her rebellion. So we know that Adam and Eve fall, and obviously God hands down consequences, and one of those is increased labor pains for a woman when she gives birth. And no one should be asking his mother or her mother if they were conceived with labor pains, because everyone was. It's very rare that you will see a very easy pregnancy. Most women are in very difficult pain, very hard pain, when they bring forth a child. And so, again, this gives evidence that labor pains originate from that account. Again, we see this in our world right now, and this is a very real thing. And so this gives weight and evidence that the Genesis account is true, and that Adam and Eve were the first two people, and that's where the human race began. Now, we definitely have to keep a proper perspective. If we completely dismiss Genesis, or just take partial information from it, then in some ways the Genesis account is not really a factual document. It doesn't really present factual information at all, and we're really left with a bunch of guesswork. If it's complete myth, then obviously you have to dismiss it as that. But if it only presents certain factual information, certain facts, and some of those things are not true, then we're really kind of left with a bunch of guesswork, is what we're left with. And of course, the evolutionists themselves have this idea that humans began somewhere in Africa, but every perspective, every worldview, every ideology of where humans began has to have a starting point somewhere. You either hold to the idea that two people were raised up at the same time and somehow were able to populate the earth, or you look at the Genesis account and say, well, Adam and Eve were not the only people, or not the first two people, or the only people that were here on the earth, and that God created other groups of people. But we can see that the Bible presents and says, well, Eve was the mother of all the living. That tells you something right there. All the living. Okay? And in Genesis 5, it reveals that Adam and Eve had other children by specifying that Adam fathered sons and daughters. Okay? So, in the first generation, right at Adam and Eve, we can say that the first marriages that occurred were between brother and sister marriages. And these were not taboo until God declared them to be taboo. And we see that being declared in Leviticus 18:6, 18 through 20, where God eventually pronounces incest marriages, or marriages between brother and sisters, as taboo. And we may think that in the early parts of the ancient world, in ancient times, brother sister marriages were kind of a common practice. I mean, we see Abraham himself marrying his half sister Sarah. If we actually look at the DNA analyses that have occurred in modern times, we see that all human beings, no matter which continent they're from, they share 99.9% of their DNA with other human beings throughout the world. Only the 0.1% difference brings out, for instance, differences in facial features, hair color, body types, etc. That 0.1% is just a little bit different, but the 99.9% should tell us that we're all related in some way. We're just different variations of the first two people, our first four parents, Adam and Eve. And of course, this gives credence to us being descendants of those first two people. Now, one of the objections that that skeptics or critics bring about is that Cain, he kills his brother. We realize that Cain kills his brother, and Cain becomes troubled by the idea that someone will take vengeance on him for killing his brother Abel. And so some critics will say, well, this idea of him being, killed by someone else is evidence of other people throughout the world. And of course, we see that what God does in this case is that Cain is marked by God, and it says that whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. So, Cain is marked, and as a result, eventually he leaves the presence of God. But what we do see here is that what we can really kind of figure out is that I don't think that anybody across the world would have cared that Cain had killed Abel. I think this would have been for somebody to know that someone that was close to both Abel and Cain would have actually looked to take vengeance on Cain. Somebody halfway across the world would have not even had an idea that Cain killed Abel and would have hardly cared. So Cain wasn't afraid of people halfway across the world, but he was afraid of people within his own group, part of his own family. So that kind of takes care of that objection. Now, after Cain is marked by God, he leaves to go to the land of Nod. And there it says in Genesis 4:17, we learn that Cain knew his wife, and then soon after she gave birth to Enoch. So naturally, critics are going to ask the important question: where did Cain get his wife? And so this is another appeal to saying that different groups around the world existed, and that's how that Cain found his wife. However, the text itself does not actually indicate that Cain found his wife there. It just says that he knew his wife, that he was intimately involved with her, and she gave birth to a son. Okay, and we can answer this question of where did Cain get his wife by going back to Genesis 5 and seeing that in Genesis 5 we read that Adam fathered sons and daughters. So Cain would have already had his wife with him, and then he went with her to the land of Nod, had children there, and and would have been able to populate from there on out. Now, another thing, so not only they ask of where did he get his wife, but he decides to also build a city. So we continue on in Genesis 4:17. We learn that he builds a city. So the critics are going to say, well, there's obviously people there. Other people came to join and he built a city. Well, we can't really compare the building of a city in the ancient world with modern urbanization where millions of people live. In Genesis 4:18 through 22, that section discusses the descendants of Cain by name and lists them as Enoch, Irad, Mahujal, Methuselah, and Lamech. Lamech is listed to have two wives, Adah and Zillah, and three sons of his own, Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Lakan. And all these descendants and others, maybe some of them were not mentioned in the text, would have been more than enough to build a city and to extend the population there at Nod. Some critics have conceived the idea that where the command to be fruitful, the wording is different, and the wording is they interpret and I think they use the King James version for this. Or actually, no, they do use the King James version of it, and the word in the King James version that is used there is to replenish, which means to kind of refill. But this is probably not an accurate reading of the original text. So they'll say if it means to replenish, you're actually saying that you're refilling the earth that's already been filled once and you're just refilling it. Well, the Hebrew word is maleh and simply means to fill, fulfill, or to be filled. And of course, the straightforward commandment that is seen, and even in the King James Version, because God was just telling Adam and Eve to have children and to populate the earth, but it was not to replenish it, but simply to plenish it, to actually fill it. And so the command to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth is straightforward. It can not mean anything else but having children, a literal sense of filling up the earth. It doesn't mean to actually replenish it with more people and populate it with more people. Now we move on just a little bit further to the New Testament, and we see that Jesus, Luke, and the Apostle Paul discuss the first two people. We see that Jesus confronts the Pharisees, and he talks about the first two people, and talks about them and refers to them in reference to marriage, and makes an example of them as what it means to be married. So in Matthew 19:4 and 5, Jesus is quoted saying, "Have you not read that from the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said in Genesis 1:27, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh," Genesis 2:24. So the Pharisees were asking Jesus about divorce, and so he was trying to make an example of them and saying, look, these were the first two people. This is the way that God established it at the beginning. This model should not be broken, and it should continue this way. And to divorce is to break apart what God has put together. And so this is what Jesus presents. And so Jesus would not have used Adam and Eve as an example for marriage in a literal sense, because two people are married or get married, if they were just symbolic, if it was just myth, if they are not actual literal people. And now in Luke 3, 23 to 38, we see the genealogy of Jesus. And this goes back all the way to Adam. Even though verse 38 only mentions Adam, he is presented as a historical person in the ancestral lineage of Jesus. He is also presented as the first person because the genealogy ends with Adam being the son of God. He's not the son of anybody, but he is the son of God. Which and this would mean that that Adam did not have any parents, but was created directly by God as the first human being. So now we move on to Paul, and Paul discusses some very interesting things. So in Acts 17, Paul speaks to the philosophers at Athens and presents the only true God and only God to them. So in verse 26, he points out that God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. Excuse me. Paul is indicating that Adam is the father of all the nations because all people are Adam's descendants. Paul could not say this unless Adam was a real historical person. Furthermore, in Romans 5:12, Paul writes, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed unto all men, for all have sinned." In this verse, Paul is pointing out the fact that the first man Adam was the first person, along with Eve, to rebel against God and brought sin into the world. If this was a symbolic interpretation of Genesis, it would be, sin, them sinning, the first people to have sinned would have been just a complete nonsense point, a moot point. So therefore, Paul is appealing to Adam and Eve as the first two people and pointing to them not only as literal people in a historical sense, but also as people who were involved in the rebellion against God. And then we see in Timothy 2:13, Paul writes, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve." Now this small verse from Paul echoes what occurred in Genesis, namely that Adam was created by God first, and that Eve was formed out of Adam's side by God thereafter. So again, he echoes the account in Genesis. Paul took the account of Genesis literally. So what we see here is that we see evidences internally from the book of Genesis surrounding Adam and Eve themselves, their descendants, Cain, and what happens after that. But we also see the New Testament writers also attest, and Jesus himself attesting to Adam and Eve being historical people in a historical sense, that they actually lived and breathed just like we do today. So with that, I just want to close, and I want to say that if we completely remove the Genesis account, let's just say it's myth, we're left with guesswork. If we say it only contains some factual information about what happened at the beginning, then we're also left with some guesswork because we have to kind of pick and choose what actually did happen and what actually didn't happen, and we're not really sure about that either. So I think it's all or nothing with the account of Genesis. You either hold to it to be true 100%, or it's the other direction, because otherwise we're just involved in guesswork. So from the things that I've discussed here in this video, I think that Adam and Eve stand out as the first two people to have been created by God, to have lived on the earth, to have produced children, and to have populated the earth. And all of us are descendants of those two people. And all of us, in some way, shape, or form, are related. So whether it's a more distant ancestral relation, that's very possible, and of course for some of us it's going to be very distant, but nonetheless we're all descendants of the first two people. The Bible does say that we're all of one blood and kind, and I truly believe this. And so I hope that this video convinces you that Adam and Eve were the first two people, and that we're all descendants of those two people. And it also answers the racism question, that actually racism doesn't actually exist. It's just a social construct that people have created. We're all the same, even though externally we look a little bit different, but we're all of the same race of people, the human race. I hope this video strengthens your faith. Please leave comments or any thoughts that you may have. And God bless you, and see you later.